Imagine standing at the edge of a pristine lake. The water lies still, reflecting the sky like glass. The air is cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of minerals and earth. The silence is almost complete, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. For a moment, it feels inviting, safe, and untouched. Yet beneath that calm surface, an invisible killer waits, patient and silent. One careless step, one curious glance, and everything could change in an instant. Most of us trust what we can see. We instinctively avoid cliffs, raging rivers, or stormy seas. But some dangers don't announce themselves. They lie hidden beyond the reach of sight and sound, quietly shaping the fate of anyone who crosses their path. This is a primal fear, the fear of the unseen. We underestimate what we cannot sense and walk toward it, convinced by the placidity before us. History has shown that this calm can be lethal. One moment, everything feels safe. The next, catastrophe strikes with no warning. This is the story of a quiet beauty that holds a lethal secret, a tale of nature's hidden power, human psychology, and the terrifying consequences of ignoring what we cannot see. By the end, you may never look at a still lake the same way again. Beneath the calm surface lies a danger most of us cannot perceive. In certain lakes, carbon dioxide quietly accumulates at the bottom, building pressure like a ticking bomb. When this gas-saturated water is disturbed by seismic activity, landslides, or temperature shifts, it creates what scientists call a limnic eruption. The lake literally belches out massive clouds of CO2, heavier than air, that flow down valleys like an invisible flood of death. The most infamous example is Lake Nyos in Cameroon. On August 21st, 1986, the lake suddenly released over 100,000 tons of carbon dioxide. The gas cloud moved at 45 miles per hour, silently enveloping entire villages. People were found exactly where they had been, working, sleeping, walking, unaware that the air they were breathing had been replaced by a silent killer. Survivors found entire families lying peacefully, as if they had simply fallen asleep mid-conversation. Nearly 1,700 people and 3,500 livestock perished overnight. The aftermath was eerily quiet, a haunting stillness that underscored the lake's hidden lethality. Even scientists initially struggled to understand what had happened. How could so many die without violence, without warning, without a sound? These killer lakes serve as a chilling reminder of nature's capacity for invisible violence. The more peaceful they appear, the more lethal they can become. What makes them truly terrifying is not just their deadly potential, but our inability to sense the danger until it's already upon us. Even when danger is real, humans often fail to react. This is the paradox of denial, a cognitive shield that protects us from overwhelming fear, but can be fatal when applied to invisible threats. Our brains are wired to prefer predictability and normalcy. When confronted with a silent, creeping danger like a lethal lake, denial quietly asserts itself, convincing us that all is well. Several cognitive biases come into play. Optimism bias leads us to believe catastrophe won't touch us personally. Normalcy bias makes people assume that because nothing terrible has happened recently, nothing will happen in the future. Selective attention narrows our focus, filtering out subtle signals of danger. Even when warnings appear, unusual animal behavior, strange odors, minor tremors, the brain rationalizes them away. It's nothing serious. This denial isn't stupidity, it's evolution at work. When a rustling bush might hide a predator, hesitation meant death, so our brains evolved to assume safety until proven otherwise. Mental energy had to be conserved for immediate threats, not for distant, invisible dangers. But humans are social creatures, which amplifies denial. When your neighbor is still fishing, your brain says, if they're not worried, I shouldn't be either. This shared normalcy becomes collective denial, creating a dangerous feedback loop. Understanding this psychology is essential. The villagers at Lake Nyos had warnings for days before the disaster, but these signals were dismissed or explained away. The most dangerous enemy wasn't the gas in the lake. It was the blind spot in their minds that refused to see the threat. Joseph Mquain was one of the few who lived. He remembers waking to an unnatural stillness that felt wrong in his bones. He stepped outside expecting to hear birds, goats, his children's voices. There was nothing, just an absolute, suffocating silence that made his skin crawl. He found his neighbor sitting by a fire pit, a bowl of food untouched in his lap. Joseph thought the man was sleeping until he reached out and touched cold skin. The terror wasn't in the death itself. It was in how quietly it had arrived. No screams, no struggle, just stillness. Walking through his village felt like wandering through a photograph. A woman still clutching her cooking pot. A man mid-stride toward his door. Children who never woke from their afternoon nap. These frozen moments haunt survivors because they defy every expectation of how death should look. What were the warning cries? The desperate flight? The fight for life? Psychologists studying the aftermath found that this eerie silence was one of the most traumatic aspects. Our minds expect warning signs: smoke before fire, thunder before lightning, the growl before an attack. But here, there was nothing. How do you trust the air when it has already killed everyone you love? The psychological wounds ran deep. Some survivors suffered panic attacks whenever the wind died down, convinced that stillness meant death was returning. Others reported phantom symptoms, sudden dizziness, shortness of breath, as if their bodies remembered the suffocation their minds tried to forget. Many avoided the lake entirely, unable to look at its calm surface without seeing the invisible flood that swept away their world. The isolation compounded their pain. How do you explain that death came for nothing? That the air itself turned lethal? Outsiders heard madness in their words, dismissing survivor accounts as folklore or superstition. This disbelief cut deeper than grief. To lose your family and then have your truth denied left them alone, not only in sorrow, but in reality itself. For those who lived through the silent wave, survival wasn't escape. It was a burden they carried with every breath. Years later, the survivors of Lake Nyos still couldn't trust the air. Death had passed them by, but survival felt like a curse. How do you live when a most basic act, breathing, carries the memory of betrayal? A gentle breeze could trigger panic attacks. A too-still morning felt like death approaching. Their bodies remembered what their minds tried to forget, responding to invisible cues with terror that seemed irrational to everyone else. Some would wake gasping in the night, as if the suffocation had returned to claim them. What made their suffering worse was the disbelief they encountered. How do you convince someone that invisible death is real? When they told their stories of watching entire families collapse without warning, of children falling mid-play as if life had been snatched by a ghost. Outsiders heard fairy tales where survivors lived nightmares. This dismissal isolated them beyond measure. To lose your family and have your story treated as fantasy cuts deeper than grief. And yet, resilience grew in the shadow of terror. Communities rebuilt. Fields were replanted. Markets reopened. Survivors learned to breathe again. But every breath carried a question. Is this the one that kills me? Their hypervigilance taught them something most people never learn. That the greatest dangers often hide behind the most normal appearances. A clear lake. A silent night. The simple act of breathing. They became unwilling experts in invisible threats, able to see dangers that others dismissed. This is the paradox of surviving invisible terror. It leaves no visible scars, but it rewrites how you experience the world. To survive Lake Nyos was to breathe again, but never again to take breathing for granted. The lake had been screaming warnings for years. The problem? It screamed in a language humans refused to learn: silence. Bubbles sometimes rose from the depths, not playful like champagne, but slow and heavy. Cattle collapsed in nearby fields, their bodies unmarked, as though sleep had become permanent. Birds dropped mid-flight, their wings folding like broken umbrellas. To trained eyes, these were alarm bells. To everyone else, they were just strange coincidences. Lake Nyos had already provided a deadly preview. In 1984, it killed 37 people in exactly the same way, an invisible cloud of death that left no traces except bodies. The pattern was clear to scientists, written in silence, ignored in daylight. But warnings don't save lives unless someone listens. The problem is human psychology. We need proof we can see, hear, or smell. When that proof doesn't come, we create it from the behavior of others. When neighbors kept fishing and children kept laughing, panic felt like madness. The collective calm became its own proof of safety, a lethal consensus. The same cognitive biases that ignored bubbling water now make us dismiss rising seas, growing tumors, and toxic relationships. We trust normalcy because abnormal threats don't fit our evolutionary programming. So when the gas finally surged from Nyos that August night, there were no sirens, no evacuation orders, no last-minute escapes. Just the sound of silence, and the silence that had promised peace became the harbinger of death. This isn't just a story about geology. It's about how we dismiss dangers that don't match our instincts, about the cost of ignoring warnings. The question haunts every survivor. What other invisible killers are we walking past every day? Today, Lake Nyos sits calm and beautiful, its waters reflecting the sky like polished glass. Scientists have installed degassing pipes that release the pressure slowly, preventing future eruptions. The technical problem has been solved. The psychological legacy remains. The true horror of that night wasn't the gas itself. It was the silence. No screams, no alarms, no final warnings. Just stillness, the kind that wears the mask of safety while death moves unseen through the valleys. That silence killed more efficiently than any explosion could. It told people everything was fine until their very last breath. It made them stay when they should have fled, trust when they should have feared, breathe deeply when the air itself had become poison. The survivors understand something the rest of us struggle to grasp. The most dangerous threats are often the ones that make no sound. The same blind spot that trusted bubbling water to be harmless now makes us dismiss rising seas because the change feels gradual, ignore growing health problems because the symptoms seem minor, walk past toxic relationships because the damage accumulates quietly. We tell ourselves, if it were really dangerous, there would be signs. But sometimes the signs are written in a language we've forgotten how to read. The language of subtle changes, of things that shouldn't be normal but have become so. Lake Nyos stands as a monument carved in water. The most dangerous predators never roar. They whisper. They wait. They strike in silence, leaving us wondering how we never saw them coming. The families who died that night trusted the quiet. They had no reason not to. The lake had been silent for generations, beautiful and benign, until the moment it wasn't. We've stood at the edge of that deceptively calm lake, breathed air that once turned lethal, and walked through villages where silence became the final sound. The lesson of Lake Nyos reaches far beyond one tragedy in Cameroon. It's about the carbon monoxide leak with no smell, the structural crack with no sound, the slow poison with no symptoms, until it's too late. It's about the dangers that hide in plain sight, wearing the mask of normalcy while death gathers in the shadows. These invisible threats don't just threaten our bodies. They reveal the blind spots in our minds. The same psychology that made people ignore warning signs at Lake Nyos makes us dismiss climate change until the floods reach our doorstep. Ignore health problems until the diagnosis is terminal. Trust toxic relationships until the damage is irreparable. Understanding invisible danger trains the mind to see what others overlook. It teaches us to distrust calm when calm makes no sense, to question safety when safety seems too convenient, to listen for warnings written in languages we're not taught to understand. The survivors of Lake Nyos carry this hard-won wisdom. They know that the absence of obvious danger doesn't guarantee safety. They've learned to read the subtle signs, to trust their instincts when something feels wrong, even if they can't explain why. The lake remembers. The question is, will we?